Hello there, and welcome once again to Ramadan Conversations. We're all in this together. Presented by the Affinity Intercultural Foundation of Australia. I'm John Cleary, and I'll be hosting this series of conversations presented throughout Ramadan. Ramadan is, of course, characterised by the iftar meal, the breaking of bread amongst friends and neighbours. Well, last year, Affinity hosted over 45 house iftars and in 10 institutional iftars, including up to 350 guests. This year, COVID-19 has made that impossible. So Affinity has decided to carry Ramadan on an online platform. Ramadan Conversations is a daily 1 hour live chat, and each episode will be live streamed so that you can later upload to Affinity's YouTube page. Now, as a former ABC broadcaster with a special interest in religion, it's my great pleasure to host these conversations together with a number of assistant hosts drawn from the Muslim community to assist us. Tonight, we're joined by Abdullah Aksu. Born and raised in Australia, Abdullah currently holds the position of owner and director of Innovo Technology Solutions, an Australian IT services company. And he is also the chairman of the Amity College School. Abdullah, good to see you again.
Good evening, John. Great to be here again.
Abdullah, we're almost halfway through Ramadan, and it's been quite a year. Don't need to articulate why, but how has it been for you and your friends? What sort of difference has it made? I mean, has it affected your feelings about your daily life? And is it different to other Ramadan experiences?
Yeah, it's definitely different. Overall, it's been good, as all Ramadan months are, but it has been different. As you know, with Ramadan, the social aspect is very important and very, very busy. We'd be normally preparing food and inviting people over, and we would be going over to people's homes. Of course, that's not happening now, but I guess we've adjusted somewhat, and we've had families and neighbours bringing food to us, and vice versa. As we prepare some food, we sort of share that with our neighbours as well. So we've sort of tried to the best of our ability, sort of continue that aspect of Ramadan. But from a practical perspective, what I feel has been different this Ramadan has been specifically around, and comparing it to other years, is the ability to focus more on the spirituality and the family unit. So with Ramadan, traditionally, of an evening we would be performing prayers in a congregation at the mosque or in larger groups. But now we're performing those prayers at home with the family. And that spirituality aspect of it, we've become more tightly knit as a family. And it also has given us the opportunity to do more of a self-reflection and see the things that are really important in our lives. So I guess, we find ways to keep going. So we try to continue that social aspect. And the month of Ramadan, it brings with it so much blessings. So it's just been fantastic, as it always is.
And indeed, that spirituality aspect, which sometimes can get lost in all the after dinner celebration, that sort of matches in a very suitable way what many people are having to think about as they have to socially isolate because of the coronavirus. So there's a complementarity there.
Absolutely, it does complement each other. We to some degree where we're experiencing being isolated, some of the hardships that others that are less fortunate than us around the world are experiencing. So we get to experience that, and it's a time of reflection. You're at home, you don't have, the interactions that you used to have with people and with other activities. So it is a time for you to self-reflect. So yeah, it ties in nicely.
Well, Abdullah, it's time to turn to our special guests for this evening. And first tonight is Professor the Honourable Bob Carr, former Premier of New South Wales. He was the longest continuously serving Premier in the history of New South Wales. He received the World Conservation Union International Parks Merit Award for creating some 350 new national parks in the state. He was made a life member of the Wilderness Society in 2003. Bob entered the Senate in 2012 and served as Australia's Foreign Minister for some 18 months. Well, since leaving politics, Bob Carr has led a distinguished career as a de facto diplomat, author and academic. Bob received the Fulbright Distinguished Fellow Award Scholarship. He has also served as an honorary scholar of the Australian American Leadership Dialogue and is currently Professor of Climate and Business at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology in Sydney. Bob Carr, welcome to this Ramadan conversation.
Yeah, pleasure. A great honour for me to be with you and the community. Thank you, John.
Bob, it was World Press Freedom Day a couple of days ago. As a former journalist who had a successful career in politics, you've seen both sides of the argument. Freedom of the media has become an issue worldwide, particularly in Australia over the last 12 months. We tend to have let those sorts of issues slide with the fierceness of the events over the last summer. A continuing issue for you?
Yeah, I never thought I'd see a day when the ABC would be raided by federal police. With the ABC having done nothing wrong other than report discussions about Australian war crimes. And I never thought I'd see the day when the home of a Canberra journalist would be raided by federal police. Now, these are, as people look at this, they would think, is my country going authoritarian? Is this some sort of prelude of a fascist Australia? Now, that's not going too far. If you told, I mean, what I said, if you told me 20 years ago, 10 years ago, that this would be accepted as the way things work with federal police on film going in to the ABC headquarters in Ultimo to seize documents, I don't think any of us would have thought this credible in Australia.
Over the past decade, we've seen an increase in authoritarian populism around the world, from Turkey to Poland and now even to India. In each of these countries, nationalism seems to be linked to the powerful visceral force of religion to fuel the discontent or to lock it in for those who really have economically missed out. Do you think the West genuinely underestimated how complex and fragile a flower the rule of law democracy is as a system of government? I mean, are there bad missteps the West has made over the last 20 years?
I think we were complacent. I think after the fall of the Soviet system, after the fall of Marxist-Leninist governments in Eastern Europe, we imagined there was going to be a bright, shining dominance of liberal democracies. No one foresaw that would be that climate would be so short-lived. And no one foresaw this peculiar combination of religiosity and nationalism. And I think it is very worrying. India, which had this huge virtue of allowing its people to determine its leadership at elections, is now sailing pretty close to authoritarian impulses. And that's a deep worry. And for the first time, I think, in America, people can say there are checks and balances, but how robust are they? When Trump, for example, has managed to give himself a majority on the Supreme Court and very likely in the next few years will increase that majority. So you'd have a Supreme Court that would very likely reinforce his authority even if he moved in an openly anti-democratic direction.
This has been a part of a strategy on elements in the Republican Party linked to conservative Christian groups in the United States since George W. Bush lost power. The aim of going for the Supreme Court has been a conscious targeted strategy. but it's something that people seem to just ignore and not see the wider dimension of. And it again shows the link between religious conservatism and chauvinistic nationalism as a really potent force that we've underestimated.
Yeah, I agree with that analysis. And if it can produce these outcomes in the United States, then it can do it anywhere. Who before 2016 saw the day when America would have an authoritarian populist saying the sort of things on a daily basis that Trump says in the White House? Now, no one foresaw that. There was a view that it couldn't happen here, but it's happened. It's happened in the United States. And in the months we've got before the American people get a chance to vote on whether they continue with him or not, anything could happen. I ask our listeners, is anyone confident that Trump would never plunge America into war, Taiwan Strait, the Gulf, or North Korea, to serve the purposes of his re-election if he saw that he was behind in the polls and that he needed a national crisis to achieve his electoral college margin that he had last time? I've got no confidence. I haven't got confidence that Trump would rule that out and go into and evacuate the White House. If he had a chance of producing an international crisis with huge risks to hold on to power, I think he'd take that.
Yes, you've got the current example of leveraging the COVID crisis to add fuel to the China fire for what seems, at least on the surface with the latest allegation about the lab in Wuhan, being designed for domestic political purposes rather than for legitimate foreign affairs objectives.
Yeah, he needs an enemy. He's in enormous difficulty. He's facing defeat. His handling of the crisis has been hideously bad. He wants a distraction. And he knows that the American electorate, like any electorate, is eager to be told that there is a cunning foreign enemy who has brought this on us. And indeed, to be truthful, the Chinese are vulnerable because this hideous pandemic did start in Wuhan, and there were clearly major missteps. But it didn't have its origins, according to the best authorities, in a laboratory. He's been insisting it is, and he's actually recruited the American embassy, according to reports, in Canberra to work up a tricked up document, to slip it to a compliant and gullible journalist, and to watch headline after headline in Sydney's Daily Telegraph allege that there was a serious document supported by our security services and those of another country, unnamed, that lent credibility to Trump's claim. And then that gets circled onto the Fox News channel and taken up by Trump supporters in Washington. So it confirms the desperation of this president to create an enemy. And when national leaders of powerful countries are thinking in those terms, we've all got to be very frightened.
Yeah.
Bob, I think this segues well into the question that I wanted to ask. So Australia's relationship with Asian countries, particularly China, is important for its long-term prosperity. So how do you think Australia should navigate its way through the coming decades in maintaining its strong ties with the USA, UK and the like, and playing a really important role in a growing Asian continent?
I think the simple answer to that is with good diplomacy. Diplomacy was invented so you can do two things at once. So you can reconcile slightly different or significantly different goals. And we've got the opportunity of maintaining our partnership with China, which is important because China is the rising power and the pandemic won't stop its rise in real and in tend to see as being something that will outlive a particularly woeful presidency, a particularly awful US presidency. And diplomacy provides us with a way of doing that. Was it necessary for Australia to be out in front of other American allies and saying we want an international inquiry into what happened at Wuhan while everyone wanted to stay busy fighting the virus? I don't think we had to do that. I think we could have used other means to have kept the pressure on China to give the full accounting we all want, and to see that it really was closing down the trade in wild animal meat that was the origin of this pandemic. But we didn't have to be out there with aggressive language ahead of all other Western countries. I think that was bad diplomacy, an example of bad diplomacy. I'll give you a second example. We have every right to restrict Huawei from providing our 5G network if we thought there was any risk. I'm neutral because I haven't seen the security assessment of Huawei's vulnerabilities or problems with Huawei providing that 5G network. I'm neutral on that. But did Australia have to be the one Western country that went out in front of all of the others and said, we're going to make a worldwide campaign out of this, and we're going to go to other Western countries and tell them to lock out this iconic Chinese company? Britain took a different view. Britain said, on balance, with the support of MI5 and MI6, we think we can take their technology. So they're two examples where Australia undiplomatically went out in front of all the others with what Beijing could only interpret as an anti-Chinese position. Now, I'm not saying that we kowtow to China, not remotely, but there are ways of managing our differences.
Bob, you cite that example, and perhaps it's an example of Scott Morrison using a particular political wedge at a moment, which was to actually encourage a friend in the US and at the same time provide a political benefit here in Australia. That may be one of the few instances over the last few months where we've seen the COVID virus used for sort of political purposes, for a political advantage. You've had a successful career in politics, but and at both state and federal level. We've seen nothing quite like the past 12 months in Australia, from drought to fire, flood, and now pandemic. Despite some differences, one of which we've just spoken of, our political system seems to have handled the stresses quite well, with a minimum of politicisation. It speaks well for the strength of our system, does it not?
I think it does. I think we're making a federal system work. America's having enormous difficulty with that. I think premiers, Labor premiers, Liberal Prime Minister, want to see we get on top of this virus, and you haven't had at the national level a political leader doing what Trump does. Every day through a tweet or a media briefing until he stopped giving them, or a campaign rally, which he is itching to get back into, making a partisan point. Trump has, to take Trump as a model of bad leadership, he's blamed the crisis on his predecessor, Barack Obama. He's blamed it on other countries, particularly China. He's tried to work up a major campaign against China. Attack the opposition in the Congress. At every point he's being partisan and divisive, and we've avoided that here. And it does speak well for the ethos, not just the institutions, but the atmosphere around them.
Can I ask you another question about Australian politics and the other great interest you've had historically in the environment? Again, the federal government seems to be taking advantage of one crisis to actually look at other issues. And it's saying post this current crisis, we need to look towards what the framework Australia is going to need. And already there's discussion about some tinkering with environmental laws prior to the release of a major inquiry into just that area. What's your response to that?
Yeah, the debates tend to be about land clearing, and the warning I give is that the National Party will always press to make it easier for landowners or leaseholders to rip native vegetation out of their farms. And it is beholden on state governments to restrain them from doing that. We're a continent that has lost 2/3 of its tree cover in the period of white settlement. And we're living with that ecological loss in terms of the degradation of our soils and of our river systems. And we know our continent is notoriously prone to unreliable rainfall. So we've got to accept that all these issues are related. They come together in the most fundamental crisis we face, which is the change in climate and the prospect of a world warming at more than 2 degrees, which is what the Paris Accords are all about restraining. Everything we do must feed back into a more credible and stronger Australian response to the challenge of climate.
Those issues all revolve around what seems to have been a characteristic of perhaps the last 20 years of our political life. In the period post-war, we were building international institutions. For the past 20 to 30 years, we seem to have been pulling them apart. And yet they seem to be the very things we need to reinvest in the strengths of. Do we have the capacity to do it?
I think the challenge is for us to be a creative middle power, So the things we've done, a lot of them go back to our most distinguished Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, in that job for 8 years. The Chemical Weapons Agreement, the Arms Trade Treaty, that's a more recent one, and I came in at the end of that. It was Australia playing a leadership role, as we'd done with chemical weapons, the Chemical Weapons Convention, to bring nations together, and doing it on our own, not doing it as a running dog of the US. The Keating government set up the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, Australia taking a lead. Now, under Gareth Evans, the Cambodian peace process leading to the Cambodian peace agreement. These were the initiatives of a creative middle power. Right now, Australia sees its only international role as being a deputy sheriff of the US, to use John Howard's expression. Now, I just think we can do better than that, and in the past we've come close to doing, but we frequently have done better than that. Is our only international personality an ally of the US and, as it happens, the most uncritical, most rusted on, most fervently loyal, closest of all America's allies? Is that the only personality we allow ourselves in world affairs? And right now, that seems to be the case.
The pandemic of COVID-19 has had a significant impact on community life. I mean, particularly as it's affected some of the great religious festivals, such as Easter for Christians and now Ramadan for the Muslim community. Yet there are, it seems, some benefits in both those festivals that they traditionally encourage us an extended period of self-reflection and abstinence. So perhaps COVID can be seen as a mixed blessing in that way. You've been known as a voracious reader. Do you have any sort of tips for the bookshelf for those of us who are struggling to find another book?
Yeah, well, the novel by the post-war French novelist Camus, called The Plague, is essential reading. He describes the arrival of the plague in the North African city where he grew up, Oran, and it has a lot of echoes with what we're going through now. There's another book, yet another book on the fall of the Roman Empire, by Lyle Harper, called The Decline of Rome, and it focuses on environmental degradation and plague, pandemics, the arrival of pandemics that shook the Roman Empire to its foundations. So they're two good books, a novel and a substantial history, directly related to what we're going through.
Bob,
Great tips for those of you at home.
I just wanted to ask, over the years you've attended Affinity iftars.
Yep.
What values do Affinity and their iftars bring to society as we know it?
I think a very positive message, and that is people of different faiths coming together to explore, well, things like what we've been talking about. And I think Australia's striking success, I know we all refer to it, our success as a multicultural society, despite a few stresses over the years, has been a recurrent theme about contemporary Australia. And I think that affinity spirit, that explicit support for multiculturalism has captured, again, part of Australia's ethos that has meant multiculturalism has worked. I can think of stresses back when I was Premier and you had a short-lived period when from one community there's an upsurge in antisocial behaviour and criminal activity involving only a tiny fraction of that community. But combined with things that were happening in the world at the time, September 11 and refugee flows and Afghanistan, it could have become ugly, but it didn't become ugly. It didn't become ugly. We held together. And Affinity is part of that spirit and part of that success.
Bob Carr, an appropriate place to wind up this conversation. Thanks so much for joining us on this Ramadan conversation.
My pleasure.
Well, time now, Abdullah, after that really interesting conversation with Bob Carr, for a little music from Sally Resitoglu.
Hello once again. Tonight I will play Ras Peshev, the composer unknown. We don't know who composed it, but it's the beautiful music. So I hope you enjoy it again.
Sally, thank you for that. Another wonderful performance from Sally in Melbourne. Well, Abdullah, it's time to turn to our next special guest. And joining us tonight is Dr. Derya Iner. Derya is a senior lecturer and research coordinator at the Centre for Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University. Her research is focused around Western Muslim youth and their religious identity. Derya is the chief investigator and editor of the first and second Islamophobia in Australia reports. Derya, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you. A pleasure to have you with us.
Likewise,
Just
thanks.
tell us, we ask all our guests this, of course, how has your Ramadan experience been this year compared to years prior? Now we've got COVID-19 keeping us at home.
Yes, it is different, to be honest, and I think everyone is going through the same experience. We are trying to, I think, slow down while we're rushing from one place to the other in normal life. We were, I think, forgetting about going into our own corners, reflecting more. So I think we are given this opportunity this Ramadan, and I think that is important, and also thankfulness is in this year is in different level, because I find myself thanking for having a home, thanking for being healthy and having my family around me. So these things, I think, require a special appreciation, and I think we were able to realize these things, unfortunately, through COVID better.
Dr. Derya, you
Yes.
were the chief investigator and editor of the first and second Islamophobia in Australia reports. Could you please briefly explain what these reports are and how did they come about? What was the reason for compiling these reports?
I think that started right 2014 September, when we had Paris attacks. I think, and many attacks started to appear that year, ISIS being more active and more visible in the Western media, which I think increased also interpersonal attacks. And we were hearing here and there things are happening to Muslim women on train, on the street. So we wanted to, actually, it was Maryam Veysadeh, she's with a few leaders in the community, thought that we need to really capture these incidents. And that's how the Islamophobia Register started. And it is a community initiative. And I think people felt more comfortable to report their experiences of Islamophobia. And a few years later, we were able to compile them. And then after verification process, analyze them, what is happening, how, where, in which context incidents are happening, and also what is the hate rhetoric. So all these, I think, analysis help us to understand the manifestation of Islamophobia in the Australian context. And we found findings quite disturbing, to be honest. And when we had the second report, we found really similar, I think, outcomes. Results were really similar, which meant that these are the characteristics of Islamophobia in the Australian context, such as sometimes it's very much in line with the other Western countries, such as Muslim women are mostly targeted. Above 70% Muslim women were targeted by male perpetrators mostly. And also things are happening in places where patrolling surveillance is available under, surveillance cameras. So that is concerning as well. And most of the incidents are happening in shopping centers, where you would find a lot of people surrounding you when the incident happens. So these are disturbing results. But in the meantime, I think giving us good idea of what can be done, how we can tackle the issue better. So, and it is then, I think it will be through informed action decision, we can improve the situation in our country. I hope, this way. Yeah.
From an Australian perspective, some of these things seem to be in some ways generational. I can remember as a little child, little boy, when the first Greek and Italians arrived in my suburb in Melbourne, where I grew up, and many of the older Greek women wore headscarves and veils and in black all the time, and they were subject to mocking. It's a function of difference that's cultural, but in some ways it's just that shocking realization that other people aren't all like you. How do you think, from your research, we can achieve a more socially cohesive society and minimize these sorts of conflicts?
Yes, I acknowledge the fact that there was nothing fear of unknown. That is very normal. It is, you can always have it. The attitude is maybe taken towards immigrant communities, but now the common enemy is as if Muslims, because there is a very biased media rhetoric and political discourse, and far-right groups are increasing, and especially far-right extremism. So we find that Muslims are easy targets, acceptable targets, and that becomes an issue. How we can achieve or how we can altogether handle this problem is really, I think, acknowledging the fact that the problem is not Muslims' problem, not Muslim communities' problem. It is Australia's problem. It is an in-house problem. It's like if an older child is, harassing and bullying the younger child, parents cannot say it's your problem, just, fix it. I think as a community, as an Australian society, entire society, as bystanders, as witnesses, sometimes we shouldn't stay silent, and silence means accommodating hate, so that you find brazen perpetrators in shopping centers attacking Muslims. Also, officials should recognize it, and they need to look at the findings, what is happening, in which ways, in which circumstances, and they need to tackle it, and we need to find. Sometimes they're really easy to fix. We should really take it as a problem first, acknowledge, and then work towards.
How has the two reports been received? You would have presented them to government bodies potentially and to other areas. What has the response been? Has there been an acknowledgement that there is a real problem? So what's the general thoughts on these reports?
I think especially the first report was first of its kind, obviously, in Australia. So it received a lot of attention, international, national. In the first week of the release, more than 30 media coverage. And this second report was, I think, more successful in terms of getting public and political attention, because this happened, the release of the report was in the week of the incident happened in Parramatta. A pregnant woman was bashed by a man publicly in a cafe. So because we released the report in that week, the report was cited, addressed globally. And according to CSU's media metrics, 720 million people learned about the report around the world. And in the meantime, both Labour Party, Liberal Party, Minister of Multiculturalism acknowledged the Islamophobia and its results, and found them disturbing by releasing a statement right after the report, which was promising. And I hope we can take it to the next step. And Muslim community is also using the findings for advocacy purposes. We are reporting the findings to Human Rights Race Commissioner as well. So I think data is used commonly, and I hope it can bring as well.
Okay, I've got one other question, John, if I may.
Yeah.
As a lecturer at ISRA, the Islamic Sciences and Research Academy, what is the purpose of ISRA and what does it offer the wider society of both Muslims and non-Muslims?
Yes, ISRA is Islamic Science and Research Academy, and it has two phases. One is academic. It is offering bachelor's, master's, PhD level courses and degrees to the broader society, but also we have a community phase as well. We are trying to connect with the community, inform them about Islam's cultural differences, about Muslims, and also I think inform people correctly. For example, in this time, while we were dealing with COVID-19, it was a very smooth transition that we were able to connect with the community quickly. A lot of online courses, daytime, nighttime, weekend courses. Sometimes events are organized for kids, for adults as well. I think communities' social needs and spiritual needs are met smoothly, quickly through these social, I think, through Zoom, I think, programs, events. We were able to host international speakers as well. But in the meantime, we are also offering courses for the wider community because there is a lot of misinformation about Islam. So it is a right address to come and study Islam. And most of people also mention that they sometimes want to learn more about the Islam itself rather than the politics and social controversies. So then I think that is also a right place so that people can come and learn from ISRA. But I think especially during COVID time, people really needed spiritual strength. And that was provided by the ISRA events. But in the meantime, I think we should really recognize that such calamities are affecting the disadvantaged people more, and people who don't have access to internet or who don't have multiple devices, who don't have, who are already struggling financially. Still, I think these people are suffering, and such as asylum seekers, refugees, when we think about them trying to homeschool their children when they have limited English, how do they, cope with it is still a problem. And going back to your first question about Ramadan, I'm thinking more about them when I'm struggling with my kids, when I'm trying to homeschool them. I'm thinking more about mothers because as a mother working from home and also homeschooling 3 kids, I find mothering is really in this time very challenging. And it is Mother's Day on Sunday. That's why I think mothers really deserve special appreciation and thanking in this year, especially around the world, because they're the pillar of the family. They're bringing family members and also spiritually strengthening them. So it is not easy, especially if you're a mother working and also from a disadvantaged community, thinking that you don't have internet devices and language. So that can be more and more challenging. And we should also recognize them. And again, to me, Ramadan is a good opportunity to really think about them. And then it's not about thinking and being thankful, but also how can I help? How can be of use? This is my responsibility. And what can I do? And this is very much similar to, I think, as a person living in this neighborhood, I have elderly neighbors. How can I help them? The social responsibility becomes important as well.
Derya, that's a wonderful message to our wider society. I think that's an appropriate place to wind up this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My pleasure.
Abdullah, our final guest tonight is Professor Kevin Dunn. Kevin is Dean of the School of Professor in Human Geography and Urban Studies at the University of Western Sydney. His areas of interest include immigration, Islam in Australia, racism, local government, and multiculturalism. Kevin, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, John. Good evening, Abdullah.
Good evening,
Can you hear
Kevin.
me?
Loud and clear. Very well. So, Kevin, I'd like to start off by asking a question. So, with COVID-19 having an impact on our society that will be around for some time, it seems, and it will touch almost every aspect of our lives. We're seeing its impact on campus, on present foreign students, and on future enrolments as well, is what we're hearing. In our wider society, we've already seen it as an outlet for old xenophobic, even racist sentiments that still linger not far from the surface. So what's next for diversity post-COVID? What do you see as the potential problem areas, particularly when it comes to your areas of interest in immigration and racism?
Great questions, Abdullah. And just, I must say, Ramadan Mubarak to everyone listening in and to yourselves.
Thank you.
COVID-19 does present a particular disruption, of course, to our resilience and our community relations, our harmony. And we have seen that. And as an immediate response, my research team is developing a research project to particularly look at the experiences of Chinese Australians, maybe Asian Australians beyond that, because xenophobia unfortunately is blunt in the way that it impacts and who it's meted out against. It is like many other, and of course Muslim Australians know this, when things get said by political leaders or there are global or geopolitical events, unfortunately it gives a form of license to people who have exclusionary and negative thinking about diversity and about some groups in particular that are different to them. And they see that as a justification for them to act out their views, to say and do racist things. And that's what's happening during COVID-19. We have prominent leaders in the world making anti-Chinese statements, and people feel that this gives them justification to say and do anti-Chinese things. So look, we're going to get some data on that. We're going to get some sense of the experience of it, and what it means, and how it has differed from pre-COVID. We'll do that just as we've done it for other groups that have been a focus of antipathy at different times. But, you know, it's a spike, Abdullah, because your second part of your question was, what does it mean for the long term? Well, the good thing is that these sorts of spikes are that they fade, and we return to, you know, what is in general a positive trajectory towards a more positive view in Australia about our diversity. That is, you know, a widespread majority opinion. You know, more than 80-odd%, depending on the state, of Australians very positive about cultural diversity and religious diversity as well. Most Australians, in fact, also are very, very clear in their support for religious freedom as well. And that's a long-held form of cosmopolitanism in Australia that was particularly encultured during the Second World War and in the post-war era. So, and it was also, of course, a fix for our history of sectarianism. So we'll recover, but there'll be legacies as well that need to be dealt with. And of course, there are other groups that are too much the focus of antipathy, like Muslim Australians as well. And there's still work to be done there, and we're continuing to do research in that area.
Kevin, we touched on this with our previous guest. Many older Australians can trace the history of racism through the story of their own families, from the Chinese in the 19th century gold rushes to the Irish in the early 20th century, the Greeks and Italians post the Second World War, and on to the Vietnamese in the 1970s. So can you briefly give us a perspective on one of the more interesting aspects that you're studying, that is the geographical nature of racism and your project of developing regionally appropriate anti-racism strategies?
Certainly, John. We have a view that racism is dynamic in the way that you've just described. It evolves. It's also therefore different from place to place, and it evolves at different paces, and it reflects the tensions, the histories, the population mixes, and the challenges of all the different places. Also the socioeconomics, the different levels of higher education, etc., the different levels of struggle that are in different places. And so all of that generates a unique mix, so that racism is unrelentingly familiar everywhere, but also different. And our argument is that when we think about the way we address it then, that we should empower local people and we should respond to the specifics of racism as it's manifest in each place. And therefore, anti-racism should be regionally sensitive. Likewise, we, have led the work on bystander anti-racism in this country too, and it's for the same reason. It's to empower and tool and resource people to take action themselves in a way that's appropriate to the setting and the moment.
So you'd be suggesting that, for example, the way racism manifests itself in some places in Perth may be different to the way it manifests itself in Adelaide, and different again to the way it may manifest itself in North Queensland.
Yes, very much so. Although having said that, theoretically, the underlying aspects of it are the same, and that's why we can give it the same name. It's fundamentally about marking someone as different, as inferior. There's an intentionality sometimes involved that's intended to generate hierarchies, and the outcomes and consequences are unrelentingly familiar and depressing. So there's similarity, but yes, it is different in every place.
Migration from the Middle East to Australia over the past 30 years came as something as a cultural shock, because for most Australians, it was the first time they'd had personally to come to terms with another major world religious and cultural tradition that was fully formed. Do you think governments were rather complacent about the challenges being faced by both immigrants from Muslim cultures and the broader Australian capacity for flexibility at that level, at that stage?
I've got. I think governments could always have done more, and so you could lay a charge of complacency against the state and our bureaucrats around the thinking and around reception and around the facilitation of integration. But having said that, the the 1970s and the 1980s, in some regards, is a high moment in our concern about migrant settlement. From the mid-1990s on, we turn away from assisting people. Our emphasis on access and equity as a key pillar of multiculturalism fades. Migrants are on their own. So in some respects, when the Turkish migrants were coming here and the Lebanese, as the first big cohorts, and because there were previous cohorts of Muslims coming to Australia as well, we should recognise that, but certainly as the first two big cohorts, when they came here, it was a fundamentally different time in our economy as well, in which there was jobs and there was the reasonable prospect of fairly rapid social mobility, certainly intergenerationally. So in some respects, the settings were better, John, and I think, in fact, that shows up in the success of those migration flows.
When it comes to traditional religious and cultural celebrations such as Ramadan for Muslims or Easter for Christians, they're often regarded by believers to be signs of cultural difference, to mark the way in which one faith is profoundly different to the other. Now, I believe you've participated in many Affinity Thurs over the years, and in your experience, is the effort to see Ramadan as a way to build bridges between faiths and cultures, as Affinity has done, a worthwhile effort, or is it just too ambitious?
No, certainly not. And I'm always inspired by the efforts of Affinity. not just around Ramadan, but certainly then, their dinners, their iftars, but more generally the way Muslim Australians use Ramadan as a period to reach out, to instruct. Now, of course, it is in part, it's a small p political strategy, and it's a good one to, humanise Islam and to make clear to people that this is just a bunch of people with ordinary hopes and dreams and faith, and that they are no threat. And that's a good thing, though, still. I think, it is, unfortunately, a responsibility of even groups who are the target of racism and antipathy. It is still, we do require their help in changing the hearts and minds of ordinary people, so that they have a less fearful disposition towards Islam and Muslims. Of course, we can't make it the responsibility of all Muslims to fix that. The state bears a responsibility, as do all of us, the rest of us in society who are non-Muslims, to speak up and to stand up when we witness Islamophobia or other forms of racism, and to reach out as well, and to welcome and engage with fellow Muslim citizens. That's a responsibility that we all have. So, look, Affinity doing a great job in that regard, but it is everybody's responsibility. They're certainly pulling their weight.
Yeah,
Kevin, just quickly, if you had one or two things you'd say to a national government at the moment about what to do post-COVID, about any tensions that might arise, what were your two immediate recommendations?
Well, the first one goes to serious leadership on these issues, and the avoidance of attempting to score cheap political points from very injurious statements around groups or cultures. I'm not saying at the moment. Well, that's right. The more overt ones are worse, but dog whistles are bad as well. But because of where I started today, we have a theory called consensus theory. It says that people with these very negative views, they will do, and we know it now, we've documented it, they will say and do racist things if they think that their view is the majority view, because they've been given that sense by prominent commentary or by leadership for people in politics, etc. So responsible leadership on these sorts of issues is a key thing. And then secondly, and now this is the third time I've said it today, and I apologise for repeating myself, John and Abdullah, but it's a responsibility of us all to stand up and take action, and and have a zero tolerance towards racist expressions at the moment towards Chinese Australians, or what people think are Chinese Australians. It doesn't matter, it's unacceptable. That would be my second recommendation.
Professor Kevin Dunn, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to your contribution to this Ramadan.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, Abdullah, that's been a very challenging conversation this evening.
Very much so. A great bunch of guests again. I always like listening to Bob Carr and his strong views. I was specifically interested in his views on how we need to be diplomatic with our dealings with China going forward. I thought that struck a bit of an accord. And the work that Dr. Iner and Israel have been doing for the past few years has been very good, especially the publishing of this Islamophobia report and building that awareness in the public. And Professor Kevin Dunn's views on some of the challenges we may have coming up in regards to immigration and racism, I found they were very insightful. So all in all, just another fantastic Ramadan conversation.
Abdullah, look forward to talking to you again. And thank you at home,
Likewise,
wherever you happen to be, for joining this Ramadan. Our next episode will be tomorrow, and we'll be travelling to Melbourne. I'll be listening to my friend George Danikian converse with distinguished guests. Stay tuned on Saturday for our next special episode on sports and Ramadan. And over the past week, our conversations have featured a number of well-known guests. If you wish to view this or any of this series, you can find them on the Affinity YouTube channel. Stay safe. Have a blessed Ramadan.